phrase that a farmer in Wexford told me a good few years ago, and his thinking on it was a day in July was worth a week in August, and a week in August was worth a month of September. And I didn't fully understand what he meant until I started doing the trials here. And basically, the earlier you get them in, the more growth you're going to get out of them.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch, and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring latest insights, advice, and technical updates for the sheep industry. With a very early harvest this year, our attention turns towards forage crops, and I'm joined by Dr. Frank Campion, who's going to discuss the role they have within integrated livestock systems and the value they can bring to sheep and tillage enterprise. Frank outlines the different forage crops options, the expected yields, the class of stock that best suited. He also discusses the impact of sowing date and the importance of estimating crop yield and some of the key management considerations. Finally, Frank explains the level of land performance that can be achieved and highlights how that forage crop can generate an additional income during really quiet winter months. We hear now from Frank, who starts by discussing its role in an integrated system and the value it can add.
Look, I suppose, Kieran, in terms of a tillage point of view, there's lots of people who would speak far more better in detail than me on this, but I suppose it's crop going in after your winter crop usually, and it's mopping up nutrients that are left in the ground. It's helping with soil fertility, it's helping mop up those nutrients, and there's a benefit to having that cover crop on over the winter. But I suppose the mutual benefit from the lamb point of view is that it's a forage there that can be grazed. The lambs graze the forage, they recycle that forage back into the ground, which helps with the following year's tillage crop, and also helps in terms of your soil nutrient profile, but also helps then that you're getting extra value out of that crop in terms of if we're grazing the lamb on it, we're producing the lamb off it that's going to leave the saleable lamb, it's going to leave more money coming off that particular piece of ground and off that cover crop, an extra advantage to it. So it's a mutually beneficial thing that we can add the two systems together.
Look, it has a role in tillage systems and has a role in rotation as well, as you touched on, increasing that organic matter in the soil. Frank, from a lamb point of view or from a store point of view, traditionally those buyers are an important part of that market, so they are as well at this time of the year and in the coming months.
Yeah, and that is another big advantage to it from a sheep point of view. We'll have lots of farmers now coming to the market in the next few weeks. They'll be selling lands, be it off the hills or even in lowland areas. And, part of their system is to sell store lambs. They don't have the option, or they mightn't have the forage supplies or the facilities to finish those lambs. So they're looking for store lamb buyers to come. The more store lamb buyers we have there, the better, and the more options that are available for store lamb finishers, the better. And, where we can put in these kind of cover crops after a tillage crop that we can graze the lambs on and finish them, that brings more buyers and brings more options to the table for store lamb purchases. And that's something I suppose we've been looking at for the last number of years in terms of our hill lamb finishing work here in Athenry, and indeed on some of our better sheep farms as well, in terms of looking at brassica options of, if we put in brassicas after winter cereals, what sort of performance can we expect to see out of lambs? And I suppose what are the blueprints or the kind of targets we need to set within those systems to make them a viable lamb finishing system?
I suppose, look, we have to put this in context. A lot of the tillage farmers we're talking about here are livestock farmers as well. They are actually finishing those lambs on the crops. And in some cases, it's a standing crop being rented out to finish, basically.
Yeah, that's it. So for some cases, yeah, as you say, there's a tillage farmer there. He's putting in a standing crop. He rents it out. There's a neighbouring sheep farmer who can put some of his own lambs on it. He might buy in lambs for it. Some people might use it to hold over ewes during the winter when they might be trying to close up grass but not ready to house yet. So there's loads of options there, and look, we would have farmers working with us within the Better Farm program, where it would be an integrated system where they would have tillage, beef and sheep on the farm, and the tillage and the sheep systems intertwined in the winter. And so far as after they cut their winter crops, they're able to go in, put in some of the brassica catch crops, then they use it for finishing or remaining lambs, overwintering ewes, or they buy in store lambs in the autumn time and put them onto that crop then. It's an additional income on the sheep side of the house, and so far as we're bringing in sheep for the winter months to graze those crops, but we're not required to, I suppose, add lamb and ewes to the flock where we mightn't have the housing or facilities for them. But at the same time, there's a knockback, a benefit then to the tillage system we've already discussed in terms of, increasing the organic matter, improving our crop potential the following year then as well.
Okay, you've set the scene fairly well for me. Let's talk a little bit about what the potential crops are. I suppose we're looking at this from a grazing point of view. Obviously, there's a lot of different forage crops we can put in over the winter, but from a sheep system, Frank, there's different crops there. They're going to have different yields and different potential. Maybe just in crude terms, could you outline to us kind of what yields and what you could be putting in?
Yeah, so look, I think that's the first key point, Kieran, right? So if you were a tillage farmer and you're looking at this, there's lots of different options that you might put in, right? And some of them will be suitable for grazing, and some of them will not be suitable for grazing. But if we take this purely from a sheep point of view, you're generally at the moment looking at your kind of brassica type crops, and there is a need, I suppose, to branch out that work, and that's something we're discussing here into non-brassica crops. But I suppose at the moment, it's predominantly brassicas. So you're talking about your forage rape, your hybrid brassica. Some people will be putting in stubble turnips or Swedes, and a lot of it will depend, I suppose, on what you're trying to do with those crops and when you get it in. So some of the crops maybe like kale, I suppose Swedes, some of them can be quite difficult to grow the later on we get in the year. So, they're not suitable for going in after a cereal crop, and are probably better put in as a standalone crop where the ground is plowed up and tilled in kind of May, June, and we get them in early to get a start on them. And there's pros and cons to doing that depending on your system. So what we're realistically looking at is your kind of, from a lamb finishing point of view, your forage rape or your hybrid brassica. And then if you're going maybe grazing yos on it, or you're looking to put more of a below ground crop in, something like a stubble turnip.
Okay, so there are the different options here. You've outlined the yields. Look, I suppose most of the work, Frank, has focused on the brassicas. Probably just getting that better response, better yield, maybe easier grazed, I suppose, another consideration.
Yeah, so look at, as I said, your brassicas or your turnips. I suppose we've focused on the forage brassica and the hybrid brassica for the lamb finishing work for a couple of different reasons. And one of them reasons is just the type of animal we're putting on it. So our forage rapes and our hybrid brassicas, they're an above ground plant. There's a stalk stem on it. The leaves are coming out for us all above ground where the lamb is grazing. So for a lamb where it still has its lamb teat, or maybe changing over teat during the winter, it's easy for them to graze. Intake isn't as impacted by poor ground conditions, particularly with a slightly heavier yielding crop where the leaf is well above the ground. So we don't tend to lose as much crop to the lambs trampling it into ground when ground gets wet and soft later on in the year. Something like a stubble turnip is probably more suitable to your yos, where you have a full-mounted sheep and they're better able to scoop out that turnip out of the ground, better able to get value out of it, maybe compared to a younger lamb. Now, look, I suppose the one caveat with that, with the turnips, if you are putting yos on it, you do need to be careful that there's no broken mouth yos going on it because they'll struggle with it. But from a lamb finishing point of view, you're typically looking on your forage rape and your hybrid basket somewhere around 3 to 6 or 7 tons at best. And look at your 6 or 7 ton crops are generally crops that have went in early July, and they've got maybe some additional fertilizer as well as whatever they mop up in the ground left behind by the tillage crop. When you're talking about your real typical crop that goes in after a tillage crop, your forage rape hybrid brassica, we've seen, variable yields, but somewhere around 2.5 to 4 tons of dry matter per hectare. And that's a very important figure when we get on to discussing how we're going to, I suppose, spread that out, or how we're going to yield that for the lambs and how many lambs we're going to be able to put on it later in the year.
That's one part of yield in terms of what we picked to go in. Obviously, there is other considerations. Probably, Frank, one of the biggest of those is the sowing date.
Yeah.
Now, this year has brought advantages and disadvantages from that point of view. The crops have probably never been harvested as early, but conditions maybe at the moment are not ideal. But in general terms, maybe talk to me about the impact sowing date can have on some of those.
Yeah, so it's I'm going to be slightly unscientific here now, Kieran, and give you a phrase that a farmer in Wexford told me a good few years ago. And his thinking on it was a day in July was worth a week in August, and a week in August was worth a month of September. And I didn't fully understand what he meant until I started doing the trials here. And basically, the earlier you get them in, the more growth you're going to get out of them. And that's why typically they go in after winter crops because they're cut earlier and we have that chance to get them in earlier in the year. Kind of once we get beyond mid-August, and in very definitely by the time we get to September, from a sowing them to graze them with lambs point of view, we're really struggling on yield then. That's really going to pull down the yield. We do need to get them in late July, early August, so they have a good chance to get up and get going, and we can get that kind of 3 or 4 ton crop, which will give us real grazing power later on in the year, insofar as we'll be able to put more lambs on it, but also we'll get better utilization insofar as we won't have a very low yield and low crop that's going to get trampled on, or that's not going to be able to hold a lot of lambs for a prolonged period of time. So it's earlier the better. As you said, this year presents a unique opportunity, maybe. Like we're recording here now on the 23rd of July, and there's people in parts of the country cutting spring barley, which would be unheard of for most of those people that are cutting spring barley on the 23rd of July. So it probably gives them more area that they can potentially put these types of crops into if it fits in with the rotation on the farm. So we would have been here maybe a few years ago where we would have had very wet Julys, which might seem a bit mad to think about in today's climate. But, and we would have been looking at options where maybe we weren't going to get them in on time, and there would have been a discussion about, well, is it worth putting in a basket crop for feeding lambs on because we won't get the yield? But it's the opposite situation this year. But I suppose the couple of caveats around that are first of all, it has to fit in with your rotation. So, brassica crops, brassica crops should only go into a field at least 1 year in five, no more than that in terms of a club route. And for people involved in tillage and so on, I'll see drape, they'll know more about that, but it's worth talking to your tillage advisor and agronomist about that to make sure you're getting that rotation right so you're not causing long-term disease problems around the farm. But also then the other side of that in terms of getting it in is, look, it's very dry at the moment. There's probably not a lot of moisture around in terms of getting to till land and get it to grow, but it's about being ready that when we do have the conditions, there's still a big window of opportunity to get it in. There's good heat in the ground, and be ready to sow that when you can, where you can.
Yeah, no, Russia seeds. I suppose, look, we also have to consider those regulations. Not every field will be suitable. Maybe not every field suitable either to graze during the winter, just from a practical point of view.
Yeah, so there is a deal of regulations around that, and once again, every farmer should look at that individually and talk to their advisor or talk to whoever they deal with on their tillage side to see what those are in terms of buffer areas between permanent fences, between ditches, between rivers, and then in terms of having enough lie-back. So, not every field is going to be suitable, but, where they are suitable, it's about having a plan in place and then making sure your rotation is right. And like I said, it's probably opens up more options this year so far as that there's a lot of spring crops being cut early and so far as it might give more suitable fields that weren't available in the past or available now this year for some of these cover crops.
Okay, let's assume we get them sown in. I suppose we need to know, well, what's the carrying capacity of them. It's an important consideration, Frank, because like, I suppose the aim with any of these things is to get as much weight on them and get as many finishes as we can off them.
Mm.
When could you look at that and make a stab at what the carrying capacity is?
Yeah, so look at from a lamb finishing point of view, and that's what we're looking at here. It's about getting the lambs on it, getting the best utilization of the crop, but also the best utilization that allows us to grow the lamb. So in terms of how we do that, it all comes back to yield. And yield will determine how many lambs we're going to carry. And realistically, you're looking at some time, if you were to get sown next week or the week after, we'd be probably talking middle to end of September before we'd start seeing it getting an accurate degree on the yield of that as to how many lambs we're going to be able to hold. Now, look, if people are used to sowing these crops, we'll have a fair idea in a couple of weeks once the plant gets up over the ground, in terms of how it's established, if it's crowding out any potential weeds that are there, they'll start to get an idea of what sort of an establishment they got. But you're going to be getting into middle to late September again. You're going to be able to go through with your quadrate, take a yield off it, and start estimating how many lambs you're going to put on it. Now, the other thing I would say, and we see that from experience here with the trials in Athenry, is these crops will stay growing in October. Fine, it'll be a lot less growth, but when they're up and they're established, they will stay growing right into October, November. But you're around kind of the middle to end of September before we start getting a yield that we can start accurately saying, right, this is the amount of lambs we're going to be able to hold for the autumn and into the winter.
And Frank, just going on that, like I'm assuming we're getting crops, if we get crops in the next couple of weeks, we're kind of looking at that October grazing date to start for those crops, really.
Yeah, we are. We are. Now, look, for some people, they won't want to graze them then, and they will hold on. And realistically, these crops can be grazed anytime up until end of January. And why they say the end of January is when we get into February, they will start to flower. And once these crops start to flower, we're not grazing them because when they flower, some of the seeds they put out can be toxic to lambs. We don't really fully understand the effect that that'll have or how toxic or untoxic it is. And we will hear very different stories of how people get on with it. But the general advice is once they start to flower, we stop grazing them. So, you could graze them realistically anytime from October up until middle to end of January. And once their lambs or stock are out before the plant starts to flower.
And look, we've touched on frost damage and things like that before, which in podcast, there's lots of considerations
Yeah.
here. But yeah, it's a fair, in terms of general terms, it's a fair rule. Look, I suppose one other element, we talked about putting on cheap gain. It's not going to match ad lib meal systems, but what is a reasonable expectation, the kind of performance on a daily or weekly basis we can get at these crops?
Yeah, so look at you're going to get a variation, and you're right. This is not ad lib meal. This is not going to give that level of performance. But you have to think about what we're talking about here. We're talking about a forage that we're grazing from October into the winter into January. So we're talking about grazing a crop in the time in a time of year when rainfall is going to be relatively high, utilization on forages is typically low. And what we're seeing doing the trials here in Athenry is we're getting Scottish blackface lambs off the mountains in August, and during November, December, January, we're able to get them lambs to consistently do around 130 grams per head per day. And we're getting crossbred lambs that are doing about 160 grams per head per day. And that's consistently, once we get them adapted on the crop, we get over the kind of gut fill change that we see when we go onto these crops. we're getting that consistent level of performance, and what that is quite a very good level of gain, to be honest with you, on a forage during the winter. And the idea behind that is, or what we're seeing anyway, is that we're able to finish some lambs off it. So some of them heavier lambs going onto it, we get them up to finishing weights. We do put on muscle and fat. They finish to good carcass weights and good grades. But equally then for those lighter type lambs, we're actually putting sheep gain on them that we wouldn't get off grazed grass at that time of year, particularly November, December, January, when rainfall levels are high and utilization and grass quality is poor. So that by the time we do need to start putting in concentrates, January, February onwards, we have them up at a weight that it's economical to start feeding them. And it's economical maybe to house them and start feeding them, or start feeding them outside, whatever the system is. So it has two roles to play as far as I see. Your heavier type lambs, yes, you'll finish them off it. And your lighter type lambs, you're going to get enough gain on the crop before you start feeding meal that it will make it economical to start feeding them.
So depending on type of lamb, we're looking something in the region of a kilo a week. But as you said there, it's very workable at that stage.
It's very
Frank,
workable at that stage, at that time of year, when you consider what the other options are.
No, I think that's a fair point. Frank, we kind of started this talking about an integrated system, and you mentioned it's another crop. Look, we talk about the forage crop. The reality is the lambs are the other crop in terms of something to sell. There's a margin we had of this, and it sells, and we often talk about this in basic terms, but it sells at a time of year that's otherwise quiet on a lot of farms as well. And that can't be underestimated. Like, it can be quite a good and effective system during the quiet months on the farm.
But that's it. Like, so, for most farms, that kind of January, February, March period can be a slow time from a cash flow point of view. So, for a lot of people buying these as store lambs now, be it from hill areas or non-hill areas in the coming weeks, the options that they're looking at are finishing these lambs in January, February, March, when there's an extra cash flow, an extra boost into the farm in terms of sales. And look, we've done a bit of work on this over the years, and you've been involved with this, Kieran, working with some of the better farmers. And what we've seen with these type systems, where they're done properly, is there is a good margin per head to be made on these type lambs when we buy them right, we set up the system correctly, where they're managed well, and we're selling then in that kind of January, February, March period. And it's not only is it worthwhile from the cash flow point of view, it's economically worthwhile, so far as it's a profitable system as well.
Frank, good catching up with you. Certainly something to focus on maybe in the coming weeks. There's an opportunity there for a lot of farms, and as we've said there before, it's another system that can mutual benefits to both the tillage and the overall production.
Exactly. That's exactly it, Kieran, and that's the way it needs to be looked at. And the other caveat, I suppose, I'd add with it, not to end on a small downer, but it's not for every farmer, but where it does work, it's quite effective. It has to fit into the overall system. So while it doesn't suit everyone, there is a cohort out there who it will be quite good for.
Frank, good catching up with you. Thanks for the update.
Thanks very much, Kieran.
We leave it there for this episode. I'd like to thank Frank again for coming on with us. I'm sure it's a subject we'll come back to later on in the year, so we hear about some of the performance on the trials in Athenry. That's it for me. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.